By the time American forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, the United States Army was being led by two men who represented completely different ideas of how wars were supposed to be fought. Dwight D. Eisenhower believed wars were won by balance, balance between allies, balance between egos, balance between military necessity and political reality. His strength was not tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but his ability to hold together a fragile coalition of Americans, British, Free French, and eventually Soviets, all with competing priorities and deep mistrust of one another. George S. Patton believed wars were won by violence, speed, and relentless pressure. He had no patience for delay, compromise, or diplomacy. In Patton's mind, every pause gave the enemy time to recover. Every defensive posture was a failure of will. Victory belonged to the side that moved faster, struck harder, and never stopped. From the very beginning, these two philosophies were on a collision course. Eisenhower rose rapidly, not because he dazzled superiors with battlefield heroics, but because he understood people. He could negotiate with Churchill without insulting him. He could listen to British generals without dismissing them. He could absorb pressure from Washington while keeping operations moving forward. In a coalition war, that made him indispensable. Patton, by contrast, was uncontrollable. He spoke openly. He believed deeply. He saw war as a calling, not a profession. His language was crude, his opinions blunt, and his confidence absolute. He did not adjust his views for political convenience, and he did not soften his words for public consumption. Eisenhower knew early on that Patton was dangerous, not because he was ineffective, but because he was effective in ways that were hard to control. This was the paradox at the heart of their relationship. Eisenhower needed Patton's aggression, but feared its consequences. Patton respected Eisenhower's authority, but despised the restraints placed upon him. During the North African campaign, Patton proved he could restore discipline and momentum to shattered units. Eisenhower took note, but he also noticed something else. Wherever Patton went, controversy followed. Patton did not merely defeat enemies, he offended allies. He embarrassed superiors. He created political problems that Eisenhower was then forced to clean up. As the war expanded and American forces prepared for Europe, Eisenhower was promoted again, eventually becoming Supreme Allied Commander. His responsibilities multiplied. He was no longer just managing armies. He was managing governments. Patton, meanwhile, saw the war narrowing to its essential question: who would reach the enemy first, and who would crush him completely? This difference was not personal at first. It was structural. Eisenhower's war required patience. Patton's war required urgency. Eisenhower needed predictability. Patton thrived on chaos and ended a coalition war. Predictability always wins. By 1943, Eisenhower had reached a conclusion he would never state openly. George Patton could never be allowed to operate without restraint. Not because he lacked skill, but because his skill threatened the larger political architecture of the war. Patton, for his part, believed something equally dangerous. He believed Eisenhower was holding the war back. The stage was set, and it would only take one incident to turn quiet tension into open containment. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to WD2 Declassified. This series doesn't retell famous battles. It breaks down the decisions, documents, and command wars that shaped the outcome of World War II, using real records, real orders, and real consequences. By 1943, Eisenhower was no longer evaluating Patton as a battlefield commander. He was evaluating him as a liability. Patton's victories in North Africa and Sicily were undeniable. His ability to restore discipline, push units forward, and overwhelm German defenses had few equals in the Allied command structure. But Eisenhower understood something Patton never accepted. The war was not only being fought against Germany, it was being watched by the world. Every action taken by an American general carried political weight. Civilian populations mattered. Allied perceptions mattered. Soviet interpretations mattered. And Patton, despite his military brilliance, repeatedly showed that he did not care how his actions were interpreted outside the battlefield. Eisenhower began to see a pattern. Whenever Patton was unleashed, results followed quickly. And so did problems. Complaints from Allied officers, reports of harsh discipline, incidents that required explanation, justification, and damage control. For Eisenhower, this created an operational dilemma. Patton delivered speed, but at the cost of stability. And stability was Eisenhower's primary currency. This was not a question of trust in Patton's competence. Eisenhower trusted Patton to fight. What he did not trust was Patton's restraint. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower could not afford a general who might say the wrong thing to a reporter, offend a British counterpart, or provoke political backlash at home. He needed commanders who followed orders not only on the battlefield, but in public, in private, and in principle. Patton followed orders in battle. Everywhere else, he followed his instincts. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower began making a quiet but critical decision. Patton would be used when his aggression was needed, and contained when it was not. This containment was subtle at first. Reassignments, delays, increased oversight, restrictions on autonomy. Eisenhower did not confront Patton directly. He managed him. Patton sensed it immediately. In his diary, Patton began writing about missed opportunities, unnecessary pauses, and what he believed was a lack of killer instinct at the highest levels of command. He did not yet name Eisenhower as the problem, but the implication was clear. The leash was tightening. And then came the incident that would give Eisenhower complete control over Patton's fate. In August 1943, during the Sicilian campaign, George Patton walked into 2 different field hospitals and struck 2 different soldiers. The incidents themselves were brief. Their consequences were permanent. Patton encountered men suffering from what was then labeled battle fatigue. To Patton, these men were not wounded. They were cowards. He shouted at them, accused them of malingering, and, in 2 cases, slapped them across the face. His words were harsher than his actions. He told one soldier that he should be ashamed to wear the uniform. At the tactical level, nothing changed. The campaign continued. Patton kept advancing. German forces kept retreating. At the strategic level, everything changed. News of the incidents reached Eisenhower within days. At first, Eisenhower reacted privately. He was furious, not because Patton had disciplined soldiers, but because he had done so in a way that could not be defended publicly. In an American army fighting a democratic war, striking hospitalized soldiers was indefensible. Eisenhower faced a decision that revealed the true nature of his leadership. He could remove Patton permanently and risk losing one of his most effective commanders. Or he could punish him severely, keep him, and neutralize the political damage. He chose the second option. Eisenhower forced Patton to apologize publicly to the soldiers involved. He reprimanded him formally. He made it clear that Patton's career now depended entirely on Eisenhower's judgment. This was not just discipline, it was leverage. From that moment on, Patton's future rested in Eisenhower's hands. Every assignment, every command decision, every opportunity would now be filtered through a single question. Is Patton worth the risk? Patton understood what had happened. In his diary, his tone changed. The confidence remained, but something else appeared alongside it. Anxiety. bitterness, a sense of betrayal. He believed he had been sacrificed for political optics. Eisenhower believed he had prevented a strategic disaster. What mattered was the outcome. Patton was removed from front-line command at a critical moment. He was sidelined during the planning stages of the invasion of Europe. His absence was conspicuous. His frustration was obvious. But Eisenhower had not finished using him. Instead of giving Patton an army, Eisenhower gave him a role that would both exploit his reputation and keep him safely away from real authority. In early 1944, while the Allies prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, Eisenhower made one of the most calculated decisions of the war. He turned George Patton into a ghost. Patton was placed in command of the 1st U.S. Army Group, a massive force on paper that did not exist in reality. This phantom army was positioned opposite the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Its purpose was not to fight, but to deceive. Operation Fortitude relied on one central assumption. The Germans believed Patton was the Allies' best offensive commander. If Patton was in charge, the main invasion had to follow. Eisenhower understood this. He also understood something else. By assigning Patton to Fortitude, he could use Patton's reputation while keeping him completely removed from real operational authority. Patton hated the assignment. From his perspective, the invasion of Europe was the decisive moment of the war. To be excluded from it was humiliating. To be used as a decoy was worse. He was reduced to inspecting fake tanks, reviewing imaginary units, and maintaining the illusion of command. Publicly, Patton played his role. Privately, his diary burned with resentment. He believed he had been sidelined not because he was unfit to fight, but because Eisenhower did not trust him to behave. Eisenhower never said this openly. He did not need to. The structure of the assignment spoke for itself. While Eisenhower coordinated the most complex amphibious invasion in history, Patton waited. His presence was vital to the deception plan. His absence from Normandy was equally intentional. Operation Fortitude worked. German forces remained fixed on the Pas de Calais long after Allied troops landed in Normandy. Divisions that could have crushed the beachheads were held back, waiting for Patton's non-existent army. In that sense, Patton contributed to D-Day without firing a shot. But the cost was personal. Patton watched the war move forward without him. He read reports of battles he believed he should be leading. He saw opportunities passing by while he commanded nothing. Eisenhower, meanwhile, had achieved something critical. He had neutralized Patton during the most politically sensitive phase of the war, while still extracting value from his name. This was containment perfected. But containment could not last forever. By the summer of 1944, the Allied advance in France slowed. German resistance stiffened. The need for aggressive leadership returned. Eisenhower faced a familiar dilemma. He needed Patton again, and Patton was ready. By late July 1944, the situation in France was changing rapidly. The Normandy landings had succeeded, but the breakout was slower and bloodier than expected. Hedgerows, German counterattacks, and logistical congestion were grinding Allied momentum down. Eisenhower needed speed again. He needed a commander who could turn chaos into movement. That commander was George Patton. On August 1, 1944, Patton was activated as commander of the newly formed U.S. Third Army. On paper, this looked like a full restoration. In reality, it was a conditional release. Eisenhower's orders to Patton were precise and limiting. Third Army would operate within clearly defined boundaries. Major axis shifts required approval. Coordination with British and American formations was mandatory. Patton was to advance, but not improvise strategically. Patton read the orders and understood the message. He was back in the war, but under surveillance. What followed stunned nearly everyone. Within days, Third Army exploded out of the Normandy bottleneck. Patton abandoned linear advances in favor of fluid movement. Units pushed forward continuously, exploiting weak points before German command could respond. Supply columns were stretched to their limits, often rerouted on Patton's personal orders. Fuel, not resistance, became the primary obstacle. Patton's tempo created a new problem for Eisenhower. Third Army was advancing faster than Allied planning could accommodate. Maps were outdated within hours. Liaison officers struggled to keep up. Command coordination began to fray. Eisenhower watched the reports carefully. Patton was doing exactly what he feared and exactly what he needed. As Third Army surged across France, Patton repeatedly tested his restrictions. He advanced when permission was ambiguous. He interpreted silence as approval. When confronted, he justified his actions with results. German units collapsed under the pressure. Entire formations were bypassed, encircled, or forced into disorganized retreat. Patton's methods worked. But every success reinforced Eisenhower's concern. Patton was not just defeating the enemy. He was destabilizing Allied command cohesion. The leash held, but it strained. Eisenhower responded by tightening oversight. Orders became more explicit. Boundaries were reinforced. Patton was praised publicly and restrained privately. Patton, meanwhile, grew more convinced that higher command lacked vision. In his diary, he wrote about missed opportunities, delayed exploitation, and what he believed was a failure to recognize the enemy's fragility. The conflict between the two men was no longer dormant. It was active. And then, in December 1944, Germany struck back. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last strategic offensive in the West. The plan was blunt and ambitious: smash through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a political rupture inside the coalition. It was not a plan built on abundance. It was built on the idea that one shock could undo everything the Allies had built since Normandy. For Eisenhower, the first hours of the attack were a test of command structure. Not courage, not tactics, structure. The front in the Ardennes was held by units that were tired, spread thin, and sitting on what the Allies considered a quiet sector. The Germans hid in poor weather under heavy cloud when Allied air power could not dominate the battlefield. In the first day, roads clogged, signals broke, headquarters lost track of who was where. Reports arrived late and contradicted each other. The map on the wall stopped matching reality. Eisenhower's immediate problem wasn't the German spearheads. It was the possibility of Allied paralysis. Coalition warfare collapses when command becomes confused. British and American formations begin to act separately. Reserves get committed in the wrong places. Supply routes collide. Units retreat without coordination. Panic becomes contagious. Eisenhower moved to stop that infection. He began pulling the war back into order through decisions that weren't glamorous but were decisive. He shifted command responsibilities. He re-anchored the front around defensible terrain and key road junctions. He prioritized restoring a coherent line, even if it meant giving ground. He focused on re-establishing the basic logic of the Allied war machine: who commands, who supports, who moves, and when. Patton saw the same battlefield and read it like a different language. Where Eisenhower saw the danger of fracture, Patton saw the German army doing exactly what he wanted it to do. The Germans were concentrating, burning fuel, forcing themselves onto roads, funneling into predictable corridors, committing their last armored reserves in winter. To Patton, that meant the Germans had finally made themselves vulnerable. Patton's instinct was not stop the bleeding. His instinct was hit the arteries. The crucial moment came at the command conference on December 19th. This meeting matters because it's where the myth and the reality split apart. It is often told as a dramatic moment where Patton boasts he can turn north in 2 days, and save Bastogne, as if he invented the idea in the room. The reality is more frightening and more impressive. Patton had already been preparing. Patton had suspected for weeks that Germany would attempt something desperate in the West. He wasn't certain of the exact location, but he was certain of the logic. If the Germans were going to gamble, it would be before Allied air power and numerical superiority strangled them completely. Patton's staff had been pushing contingency planning, route studies, bridge assessments, traffic control plans, not because they knew the Ardennes was coming, but because Patton ran his army as if the enemy's next move was always the one that could embarrass you. So when Eisenhower asked how quickly Third Army could pivot north, Patton's answer wasn't theater. It was a trigger. He said he could attack in 48 hours because his staff had already drafted the orders and studied the roads. He had already started aligning units for a possible shift. He had already rehearsed the mental move that most commanders fail at in crisis, abandoning your current plan immediately, without grief, without hesitation. Eisenhower listened, then made the kind of decision that defines him. He didn't say yes because Patton was charismatic. He said yes because the math demanded speed. Bastogne was surrounded. The road network there was the skeleton key to movement in the Ardennes. If the Germans held it, Allied logistics would be throttled. If the Allies held it, German armor would be forced to bleed itself out in winter woods without freedom of maneuver. Eisenhower's approval unleashed Third Army, and what happened next was not a simple turn north. It was one of the most complex Army-level pivots of the war, executed under pressure in winter while maintaining the ability to fight. Patton's corps had been oriented east. To hit the Bulge, they had to rotate their entire operational focus north. That meant moving headquarters, shifting artillery zones, rerouting fuel distribution, reassigning engineers, and controlling traffic on roads that were already jammed with refugees, retreating units, supply convoys, and reinforcements from other commands. In modern terms, it was a nightmare of logistics. In Patton's terms, it was Tuesday. Patton pushed his staff hard, not with vague motivation, but with a relentless demand for specificity. Which routes are open? Which bridges can carry armor? Which road junctions are the choke points? Which villages must be cleared first? Where will the Germans likely establish blocking positions? Where do we place military police to keep columns moving? How do we prevent vehicles from freezing and failing? How do we keep fuel moving when the front is shifting faster than the pipeline? This is the part people forget. Patton's speed was not mystical. It was administrative violence. Third Army began moving in brutal winter conditions. Units drove through snow and ice, headlights off, under blackout rules. Men slept in vehicles. Engines ran constantly to keep from freezing. Artillery pieces were dragged through roads that weren't made for that weight. Columns stopped and started for hours at choke points, then surged forward again when traffic control opened up. Patton's greatest weapon here was not a tank. It was tempo. Tempo reduces the enemy's ability to understand what is happening. It compresses their decision time. It forces them to react rather than plan. As Third Army began to attack toward Bastogne, the Germans were still intoxicated by their own early gains. Their armored columns had advanced rapidly, but they were already paying the price. Fuel shortages, stalled vehicles, choked roads, flanks thin and exposed, infantry struggling to keep up, commanders fighting the weather and the terrain as much as the enemy. Patton's attack hit the southern shoulder of the Bulge like a hammer blow into a joint. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean. German units established blocking positions in villages, on ridge lines, and at road junctions. They fought hard because they understood what Patton's move meant. If Patton broke the shoulder, the Bulge would become a trap. Not for the Allies, but for Germany. Patton's force pressed forward anyway, trading casualties for minutes. The relief of Bastogne wasn't some cinematic sprint. It was a grinding push through winter woods and fortified points, with artillery fire ripping through tree lines and turning forests into splinter storms. It was infantry clearing houses room by room, while armor tried to stay on the few roads that could support it. It was engineers working under fire to keep bridges intact and roads passable. When the corridor finally opened and Allied forces reached the surrounded defenders, it was more than a tactical success. It was a strategic deflation of Hitler's last gamble. Now here's the part that matters for our story. Eisenhower praised Patton publicly because he had to. The result was too important. Patton had proven that aggressive maneuver could change the shape of a crisis faster than cautious stabilization alone. But Eisenhower did not interpret the event the way Patton did. Patton believed the Bulge proved his entire worldview. It proved that initiative wins, that speed is moral, that the enemy collapses when you never let him breathe, that delaying for coordination is often just a way of hiding fear. Eisenhower interpreted it differently. To Eisenhower, Patton had succeeded because the system allowed it this one time under controlled conditions, with approval, within a strategic framework Eisenhower had established. The pivot worked not because Patton was a lone genius, but because Eisenhower's coalition structure and logistics depth could absorb the pivot and sustain it. And Eisenhower saw the risk as clearly as the success. Patton's method worked. Patton's mouth remained dangerous. Patton's political instability had not been cured by battlefield victory. If anything, victory made him louder, more confident, and more convinced that the war should be pursued beyond Germany toward the next enemy. So the Bulge did not free Patton. It proved he was indispensable. And in Eisenhower's world, indispensable men must be managed even more tightly. As January turned into February 1945 and Germany's western defenses began to tear open, the argument between these two men moved into its final phase. It was no longer about how to win the war. It was about what winning should look like. By February 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a phase that no longer resembled survival. Germany was breaking. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone. Rail networks were shattered. Luftwaffe sorties were sporadic. Divisions existed more on paper than in reality. Entire formations were made up of boys, old men, and exhausted veterans pulled back from shattered fronts. For Patton, this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire career. To him, the enemy was no longer capable of coordinated defense. What remained was speed, exploitation, and decisive occupation. The question was not whether Germany would fall. The question was how fast the Allies would move while it did. Patton wanted Berlin, not as a symbol, as a maneuver. He believed that if the Western Allies drove hard enough, they could reach Berlin before the Red Army. He believed Germany's final collapse could be forced in weeks, not months. He believed hesitation would only hand Europe to another enemy. Eisenhower saw the same map and reached the opposite conclusion. Berlin to Eisenhower was no longer a military objective worth the cost. The city lay deep inside the Soviet zone agreed upon in previous conferences. Any Western push toward Berlin would require crossing supply lines, risking unnecessary casualties, and potentially triggering political conflict with the Soviets before the war was even over. This was not an abstract concern. Eisenhower was managing the end of a coalition war. Every movement toward Berlin had diplomatic consequences. Every kilometer east increased the risk of misunderstandings, clashes, or escalation with Soviet forces advancing from the opposite direction. Eisenhower chose containment over conquest. In March 1945, Eisenhower made the decision that would define his legacy and end Patton's strategic ambitions. He ordered Western Allied forces to halt their eastward race and pivot toward destroying remaining German forces in southern Germany and Austria. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. This order hit Patton like a wall. From his perspective, the enemy was collapsing faster than Allied headquarters realized. German resistance was uneven, fragmented, and brittle. Patton believed a rapid thrust could shatter what little command cohesion remained and end the war outright. More than that, Patton believed Eisenhower was making the same mistake again, letting politics override opportunity. Patton pushed forward anyway, within the limits he could stretch. Third Army crossed the Rhine. It advanced rapidly through central Germany. It liberated camps. It captured cities faster than planners expected. It outran its own supply lines repeatedly, forcing Eisenhower's staff to play catch-up. But the boundaries were clear. Berlin was off limits. Patton wrote bitterly in his diary about being stopped short. He believed the Western Allies were deliberately yielding ground to the Soviets. He believed this decision would shape Europe for generations. Eisenhower did not argue publicly. He did not justify the decision to Patton privately. The order stood. This was the final victory of Eisenhower's philosophy. He was not trying to win the war faster than Patton. He was trying to end it without starting the next one. Patton did not accept this logic. He never would. As American and Soviet forces finally linked up on the Elbe River in April 1945, the future of Europe was effectively sealed. The war was ending. The lines were being drawn. Patton saw an enemy being replaced, not eliminated. Eisenhower saw a war being concluded under terms that would prevent immediate collapse of the alliance. Their conflict had reached its end state. Patton had proven everything he believed about war. Eisenhower had proven everything he believed about power, and neither man believed the other was fully right. By the spring of 1945, the war between Patton and Eisenhower no longer needed a battlefield. It was being fought on paper. Patton wrote constantly. His diaries were not casual reflections. They were operational critiques, moral judgments, and strategic warnings written in real time. He believed history was happening too fast to be left to memory alone. Eisenhower, by contrast, rarely recorded emotion. He issued orders, directives, and memoranda. His legacy would not be shaped by what he felt, but by what he authorized. This difference matters because it explains how their conflict became irreversible. Patton's diaries from March and April 1945 reveal a man who believed the war had shifted categories. Germany, in his view, was finished. The Soviets, however, were not allies in victory, but rivals in waiting. He wrote openly that the Western Allies were making a catastrophic mistake by allowing the Red Army to occupy so much of Central Europe without resistance. He did not write this hypothetically. He wrote it as a commander, still in the field. Patton believed the Allied armies, particularly the Americans, still possessed overwhelming superiority. He believed Soviet forces were exhausted, poorly supplied, and stretched thin. He believed that if confrontation was inevitable, it would be better fought immediately, while American forces were mobilized, armed, and positioned forward. These were not private thoughts kept in a drawer. Patton spoke them. He spoke them to staff officers. He spoke them to other generals. He spoke them to journalists. He spoke them in ways that Eisenhower could not contain or reinterpret. Eisenhower saw the danger instantly. In a coalition war, loose speech is operational risk. In a post-war environment, it is political poison. Eisenhower's orders during this period became increasingly explicit. Patton was to avoid political commentary. He was to focus strictly on military administration. He was to comply with occupation policies as written, regardless of personal opinion. Patton did not comply. He criticized denazification policies, arguing that removing experienced administrators would paralyze governance. He compared Nazi Party membership to political affiliation rather than criminal guilt. He made statements that, stripped of context, sounded sympathetic to former enemies. Eisenhower understood how these statements would play in Washington and in Moscow and in the press. This was no longer about Patton's aggressiveness. It was about damage control. Eisenhower began taking steps quietly. He reduced Patton's operational relevance. He reassigned responsibilities. He prepared to remove him without creating a public spectacle. Patton sensed it, but misread it. He believed his wartime value would protect him. He believed results still mattered. He believed Eisenhower would ultimately prioritize military effectiveness over political caution. He was wrong. Eisenhower had already won the argument that mattered. The war was ending. The coalition needed to survive the transition to peace. And Patton, in Eisenhower's view, had become a destabilizing force in a fragile moment. The man who had been indispensable in crisis was now dangerous in resolution. By late April, Patton's fate was effectively sealed. He just didn't know it yet. George Patton was not fired. That detail matters. There was no public disgrace, no court-martial, no denunciation, no dramatic confrontation. Eisenhower understood that removing Patton loudly would fracture the very unity he had spent the war protecting. So he did it quietly. In May 1945, with Germany defeated, Patton was relieved of command of the U.S. Third Army and reassigned as military governor of Bavaria. On paper, this was a position of responsibility. In reality, it was exile from influence. Patton had gone from commanding hundreds of thousands of men in combat to overseeing civilian administration under strict political oversight. His authority was limited. His speech was monitored. His actions were constrained by occupation policy written far above his level. The message was unmistakable. The warfighter was no longer needed. Eisenhower did not justify the decision publicly. He did not attack Patton's record. He did not question his courage or competence. He simply moved him aside. From Eisenhower's perspective, the decision was unavoidable. Patton's continued presence in a high-profile command role risked international fallout. His statements about the Soviets, his criticism of denazification, and his inability to moderate his language made him incompatible with the emerging post-war order. Eisenhower was no longer commanding a war. He was shaping a peace. Patton reacted with confusion, then anger, then resignation. In private, he believed he had been betrayed. He believed victory had been taken from his hands just as it was within reach of permanence. He believed history would prove him right. But Patton never got the chance to fight that argument publicly. In December 1945, George S. Patton died following injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. The suddenness of his death froze his story in place. There would be no post-war memoirs reshaping his legacy, no long public reckoning, no chance to challenge the narrative Eisenhower had already secured. The command war ended not with vindication, but with silence. Eisenhower would go on to become President of the United States. Patton would become a symbol. If this were a traditional war story, this is where a verdict would be delivered. But the truth is harder and more uncomfortable. Patton was right about speed. He was right about exploiting collapse. He was right that hesitation often costs more lives in the long run than decisive action. His methods broke the German army faster than Allied planning predicted. Eisenhower was right about coalition warfare. He was right that wars are not won by armies alone. He was right that alliances can collapse faster than front lines. He was right that victory without political stability can be worse than defeat. Patton fought the war he saw in front of him. Eisenhower fought the war that came after. History tends to favor Patton because aggression is easier to admire than restraint. Decisiveness looks heroic. Caution looks weak. But Europe's post-war reality reflects Eisenhower's choices far more than Patton's instincts. Germany surrendered without the Allied coalition fracturing. The Western Allies avoided direct conflict with the Soviets before the war ended. The transition from war to peace, however imperfect, did not collapse into immediate chaos. That was Eisenhower's victory. Patton's tragedy was not that he was wrong. It was that he was right at the wrong time. The command war between Patton and Eisenhower was never about who was the better general. It was about what kind of war was being fought and what kind of world would exist after it ended. And in that war, restraint defeated brilliance. If you want more document-driven, no-fluff breakdowns of the command decisions that shaped World War II, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel isn't about myths or hero worship. It's about what was ordered, what was blocked, and what history almost became.